We're discussing the Winter Olympics, about to get underway in a few days in Sochi, in Russia. And we're also looking ahead to the other major global sporting event this year, the World Cup. That's coming up this summer in Brazil. Here to talk about that is Paulo Sotero. He's an award-winning journalist, now serving as the director of the Brazil Institute, Alpha Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Joining us from New York is Andrew Zimbalist, an economist at Smith College in Massachusetts. He's written extensively about the economics of major sporting events. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you to the show. Now, as we've seen in Sochi, there's a great deal of discussion over national pride, hosting these events like the World Cup and the Olympics as well. But I'm wondering, Andrew, let me go to you first. Does a thing like national pride ignore economic realities? Look at Sochi, $51 billion, 4 times what was initially budgeted.
Yes. Well, first of all, let's be cautious about the figure of $51 billion because only Mr. Putin has all of the data. I have seen estimates that go up to $65 billion. Of course, I don't know, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion. Will there be great national pride? I know Putin certainly hopes that there will be, but it could be very ugly, what happens. It's certainly been ugly leading up to the games over the last month or so. They could have terrible weather. There could be all sorts of problems, and we know a lot of accusations are appearing in the Russian press about corruption and mismanagement. So does this all lead to pride? I don't know. Certainly Olympic hosts and World Cup hosts hope that it does, but that's unclear.
Although we have to say that in almost every event of this size, there have always been these allegations of corruption and malpractice in almost any part of the world. Paulo Sotero, there is significant opposition in Brazil to the staging of the World Cup. People have taken to the streets. There were 1 million people who took to the streets last year, complaining about things like service delivery, corruption, the high costs of staging the event, etc., especially the cost of infrastructure. And do the opponents there have a point? I mean, the bottom line is, does Brazil need stadia or do they need hospitals and schools?
Certainly they have a point, especially now that the economy is on a downturn, going down, and that idea of priorities in public spending becomes more evident in Brazil. In addition, there is evident now that Brazil has not fulfill its voluntary assumed obligation to ready stadiums, venues, etc., on the schedule that was given to FIFA. That also has created sort of a negative vibe. So it looks now like more of a kind of a negative event. When the games start, people will be attending, people, I think, will be happy. There will be a measure of pride, especially if the national team does well.
But Andrew, I'm wondering, we hear here Paulo Sotero talk about national pride. We talk about people enjoying themselves during the 4 weeks, or in some cases 2 weeks, that these events take place. But do we see advantages after that, once the crowds have gone home?
It's very hard to see advantages. Perhaps in Barcelona in 1992, perhaps in Los Angeles in 1984. With regard to the Brazilian World Cup, they're building and or renovating 12 stadiums. They're building stadiums in places like Manaus up on the Amazon. Manaus has a lower tier soccer team. It doesn't have a top-level professional soccer team. Average attendance there, I understand, is 600. They pay a couple of dollars for the tickets. Now they're building a new fancy stadium, 42,000 capacity. Certainly, if there's going to be any sustained pride and sustained benefit, they have to deal with the fact that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars per stadium in places that there's absolutely no ability to sustain it economically.
Yeah, and the point here, and that's a source of criticism, FIFA had asked Brazil to offer 8 stadiums in 8 different cities. It was the Brazilian government at the time, led by very popular President Lula, a lover of soccer, that said, no, let's do 12. And that's how Manaus, that, as Andrew was saying, has average audiences of not 600, but 6,000 people per game, gets to host part of the World Cup. What is going to happen with that stadium? We hope there will be a lot of rock concerts and religious revivals, because soccer is not the thing that happens happens in Manaus. In other cities, though, in São Paulo, in Rio, in Belo Horizonte, in Porto Alegre, in the traditional, the bigger state capitals in Brazil, there will be
Right, but
major
experience tells us that in many instances that has not happened. I mean, look at the case in South Africa, which staged the World Cup in 2010. I mean, they built all those stadia all over the country. They don't have the kind of crowds that would come to the stadia for other events.
No, be assured that in Brazil they will. We are the country of soccer. Spain, Brazil, England, Italy, Germany, those countries breathe soccer, and there will be the attendance. But the question, a legitimate, important question is, you know, how to measure the investment in those things. It looks like we have in Brazil overreached in terms of the ambition to make this thing a much bigger thing that we needed to make it. And now we are going to see the consequences.
Yeah, because we had a similar thing happen in China, in Beijing, at the Olympic Games there. The stadiums are not being used right now. Andrew, what is the attraction for a country? Because if we look at history, I mean, let's look at Montreal. 30 years it took to pay off its debt for the stadium that it built there. Greece ran up debt, public debt, of $9 billion, and that is thought to be a major reason why the country got itself into such financial trouble.
I don't know if it's a major reason. It certainly catalyzed the difficulties that the last few years have brought to Greece. But look, I mean, first of all, you have to acknowledge that worldwide sports is extremely popular. And so there's a natural inclination to embrace the Olympics or to embrace the World Cup as something that will bring attention to your area. But really what's happening on the ground is this. You have some individual companies and individuals who will privately benefit. These are usually heads of construction companies, construction unions, architectural firms, bankers who are going to float bonds. These are people who have some political power. They certainly have some economic power, and they put forward a plan to host the games. It's interesting that, you know, basically every time there's a new World Cup or there's a new Olympics, all of the countries in the world have cities that are competing against each other, and there's only one that's going to get it. And there's only one organization, either FIFA or the IOC, that gets to select it. So you have competition from around the world. Everybody's trying to convince the IOC or FIFA that they can do it better than anybody else. They overbid. And that's fine with the construction companies because it just means more income for them.
Let's look at another side of this, Paulo. You know, one of the arguments we hear for countries hosting these games, for cities having these games, is that it brings a lot of construction, as Andrew has been pointing out, to these cities. You know, stadiums are constructed, there's infrastructure constructed, there's roads, there's airports, there's hotels, other things are constructed. These things would not happen if these countries didn't get these games, did they?
Well, they should happen in the case of Brazil because we knew that the problem infrastructure in Brazil was there, independent of having or not having a World Cup or having the Olympics in Rio in 2016. Obviously, having those games concentrate minds and make people go faster, but at the same time, by allowing delays in constructions, you run up costs and you incur in the problem of indebtedness, of governments overspending on those things when you have clearly other priorities in the country, and that's what the protesters were talking about, and I believe there are indications already that the protesters may come back to focusing on that this is probably was not a very good idea. Now, having said that, from the World Cup to the Olympics, Brazil has a chance to get this right. You have 2 years. It looks like, and this according to even economists in Brazil that are more aligned with the opposition to the government, saying that they are doing public-private partnerships right in Rio. The city is mobilized. It's easier to do this in a city than to do the World Cup in a country, 12 cities, but it remains to be seen. It is a challenge.
Okay. Andrew, it all sounds good and fine, but, you know, if we take a cold, hard look at this, I mean, who really benefits from these games? Is it the people of the country, or is it the IOC and FIFA?
Again, I think that there's an argument to be made that there was a benefit to Barcelona, and the reason why the main reason why there was a benefit to Barcelona is because they had a city plan in place. Barcelona is a city. There's an area in Catalonia that had been neglected under Franco. They were getting their act together. They had a plan to reform the city. That plan pre-existed. It didn't come along when the IOC said, okay, we'll give you the Summer Games in 1992. So they used the Olympics, the opportunity to host the Olympics, to build their plan, to facilitate and accelerate the plan. What's very often the case is that cities don't have a plan beforehand. Everybody knows that the BRICS countries or third world countries need infrastructure. The question is, which infrastructure should be prioritized? How much should be spent on it? How quickly should it be done? In Brazil, and I agree mostly with what Paulo was saying about 2016, but look, they're doing infrastructure that has really very little to do. Some of the infrastructure has very little to do with the long-term development interests of Rio or Brazil. They're building public transportation from Ipanema to Barra, where many of the Olympic centers will be. That's for the tourists who stay in Ipanema who are going to go to the Games. That's not for long-term Brazilian development.
Okay, another point I want to raise, Paulo, before we go, and that is the issue of security. We've seen in the Sochi Games massive amounts of money being spent on security. There are deep concerns. Are events, big events, sporting events, like the Olympic Games, like the World Cup, become, in reality, far too dangerous to stage?
Well, in Brazil, the problem will be in the World Cup, in the Olympics, more the protests. It's not the type of security threat that we see in Sochi right now. Okay. But still, it is obviously a concern. It will require more and more public expenditure to protect tourists, attendants, etc. I think that may be over-dramatized in Brazil, but it is a concern.
Okay, gentlemen, that's where we have to leave it for now. Andrew Zimbalist, Paulo Sotero, thanks for joining us.